Alright, what's up guys? Welcome to this video. We are covering every single spirit monster in this video. I've actually taken a little break from the tier lists. I haven't been doing them because I've actually taken quite a bit of time to play a lot of various different decks, trying to put a lot of hours into different decks just to, I guess, just make the tier list a little better. But if there's any tier list that you want to see, it doesn't even matter if it's a particular archetype, just leave it down below in the comment section. And I guess let's just get started. Today we're doing spirit monsters. Spirit monsters aren't really an archetype. They're not really a type. They're more of a kind of a loosely defined summoning mechanic. Spirit monsters used to be all similar in that all of them can only be normal summoned, or they can only be set. They can't be special summoned, and then they return to the hand at the end phase. That used to be sort of the unifying factor in all of spirit monsters, but spirit monsters have changed over the years. There's actually a few spirit monsters that can be special summoned. We've got some right here. All of these can be special summoned, and then also the pendulum monsters can be special summoned. So we've got the majority of spirit monsters cannot be special summoned and return to the hand during the end phase, and then some spirit monsters actually don't follow that effect at all. But most spirit monsters return to the hand during the end phase, and most spirit monsters can't be special summoned. So yeah, they came out in Legacy of Darkness, all very exciting. They were used by Noah in the anime, and over the years they've had a lot of various meta impact. I think every single year that Yu-Gi-Oh's been around, there's been at least some kind of a spirit monster that has had some meta relevancy throughout all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And we'll talk about that. But as I'm reviewing them today, it'll be how good they are today, not how good they were over the course of time, how good they are today. But let's get started. Right off the bat, we've got Tama. This card's actually pretty good. I'd say it can go either way, B tier or A tier. I'd say it's probably a B tier card. Basically, this has, again, these all have the same restrictions. Can't be special summoned, has to be normal summoned, but when this card is normal summoned or flipped face up, you can add a spirit monster from your deck to your hand. It's a fairly good effect. You can add the high level ones, you can add the Shinobird and Shino Baroness, you can add, all of those larger cards. Basically, any spirit monster can be added on normal summon. It's a fairly good effect, and then of course it returns during the end phase. Gishki Amelia. This card's pretty garbage. Basically, what this does is if you normal summon this card, you can target a Gishki monster and then put it on the top of your deck. It's such a slow way to bring back Gishki cards. Like, even in a Gishki deck, this card is not good, and this card is definitely not good in a Spirit deck because it has no synergy with Spirits whatsoever. Has more synergy with Gishkis than Spirits, and it's not very good in either deck, to be honest. It's just too slow. Amaterasu, this is one of the many Uchiha sounding names, but this one, I'd say a solid area for this would probably be like C tier. So the issue with a lot of the larger spirit monsters is, since they can't be since they can't be special summoned, returning a monster during the end phase is just really bad. Like, if you have to tribute 2 monsters to summon a spirit monster and then it comes back during the end phase anyway, it's incredibly disappointing because you go super duper minus. Unless their effect is absolutely broken, you go completely minus. So this card has an additional restriction to Amaterasu. Basically, this card cannot be normal summoned or special summoned. It must be normal set. And then this card is an effect where if it's targeted while it's face down, you can flip it face up, draw a card, and then obviously since it's flip face up, you get its flip effect. It has not a flip effect, but a flip face up effect, which is, if it's flip face up, you can banish all other cards on the field. That effect is really good, but again, this takes a lot of setup. Like, you have to have 2 monsters, you have to tribute those 2 monsters, and then you have to flip this card, I assume, the next turn. And then after it is flipped and it banishes all other cards, it actually returns to the hand during the end phase anyway. So it's like, it's it's a slow card. I haven't seen a deck that can utilize this card just because it does require the tributes. You have to play it basically in a deck that doesn't have any normal summons. It's a special summon exclusive deck. So it's got a lot of drawbacks, unfortunately. Azura's Priest, I'd say this is B tier. This was very good in like 2005 versus Scapegoats, for example. This was actually a fairly good card back then. This card still can be used in certain decks. It can be searched off of Cyber Angel Benton, so you can use it in like a Cyber Angel deck or a Droitron deck or a Herald of Perfection deck or any sort of fairy deck. So it does have certain uses. This card also has a really cool combo where you can use this with a copy of Honest, because if you attack with this, attack your opponent's highest attacking monster or highest attack point monster, let's say they have like a Blue Eyes on the field, this will gain 3,000 attack, and then Honest allows you to keep that attack till the end phase, and then you can just continue attacking all of your opponent's monsters. So I'd say it's a fairly cool card. It's got some cool synergy. It's been good. It has been good several times in the meta. Unfortunately, right now, it's just not the best. And again, one of the big drawbacks with Spirit Monsters is that they return to the end phase and they can't be special summoned. So you can't special summon, you have to use your normal summon essentially on this card. But its effects are fairly good. Great Long Nose. I'd say this is another C tier. He's just like, I guess he's okay. Basically, he's a 1 tribute monster. If he inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they skip their next draw phase. They skip their next battle phase, which it's not bad, but you have to keep in mind something. That effect is only useful if you're going second, because you have to inflict battle damage. So you essentially will stop battle damage. You essentially will stop your opponent from attacking you on turn 3. But in reality, you're playing against a board of a ton of negates. And also, he's a 1 tribute monster, so you have to play him in a spirit deck that doesn't really special summon. And then you have to tribute this thing. I mean, I guess you can use something like Nikki Tama, but again, there are actually better 1 tribute spirit monsters available than this card, particularly for going second. So he's definitely not very good. Nikki Tama, this card I'd probably say is A tier. This card really helps the deck. So basically what this card does is when it's normal summoned, you can, during that turn, do an extra normal summon of a spirit monster. That effect is actually fairly good. Because it basically gives you access to a lot of the basically gives you access to a lot of the level 6 and level 5 spirit monsters, because you could summon the Nikki Tama and then you can tribute it immediately and then summon a level 6. Also, when this card leaves the field, if you control a spirit monster, you get to draw a card, which is also a very good effect. It has 2 fairly good effects. It used to be pretty good with Brilliant Fusion, because all you'd have to do is have a spirit monster activate Brilliant Fusion, send this to the graveyard as your light monster, and then you get to draw a card. The effect of this card is mandatory. It never misses timing. Just as long as you have a spirit monster on field and this is sent to the graveyard from anywhere, you can draw a card. I love mandatory effects. They're some of my favorite effects. Mandatory effects are, even if you can't activate them, you still activate them. That's why I love mandatory effects. But definitely, this is a very good card. Gives you an extra normal summon, gives you access to level 6s, and then on top of that, a lot of spirit monsters have their effects activated on normal summon, so getting an extra normal summon is actually a huge deal. Next, we've got Yatagaratsu. This card's probably like bottom of B tier. This card should not be banned. Absolutely should not be banned. If it was unbanned today, it would have no meta impact whatsoever. There isn't, outside of a pure spirit deck or Shinobirds or a deck with absolutely no normal summon that goes second, this card has no use in the meta. Was what I'm basically saying. What deck would play Yatagaratsu in the modern meta game? I honestly cannot even think of one. Because I made a ban list tier list I made a ban card tier list a few weeks ago, and I basically had one person in the comment section telling me that absolutely Yatagaratsu cannot come back. It is way too good, and I just don't agree. It's not that good of a card. It skips your opponent's next draw phase when it does battle damage. It's an extremely weak card. It doesn't attack directly by itself. You basically have to clear your opponent's entire board and then attack directly with this thing, which, if you clear your opponent's board in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you already win the game anyway. If they build a Dragon Link board and you clear that board, there's no point to even lock them out of their draw phase, because you've already won. Most of their recursion cards are actually going to be out of the graveyard and out of their existing hand. They have Tempest, they have a lot of the graveyard recursion dragons, and other decks are the same way, where a lot of their recursion will come out of the graveyard. That draw phase is not that impactful. So yeah, this card is just, it's not all that good. Like, it's still better than a lot of these other cards, but it's still not that great in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Emadoewado, this is by far, not even close, the best spirit monster in the game right now. It honestly is just waiting for the right deck to use it. When True Dracos was around, this card was absolutely disgusting. So what this card basically does is, it has a similar effect like all spirit monsters. You know, it returns to the end phase, can't be special summoned. But its crazy effect is, when this card's on the field, this is a continuous effect. Monsters can... Neither player can activate monster effects except spirit monsters. That is a continuous effect. It doesn't activate. It's just a continuous floodgate. And it essentially prevents absolutely everything. Your opponent can't hand trap you. They can't activate monsters in the graveyard. They can't activate monsters in the banish pile. Obviously, they can't activate things on the field. They are literally locked out of using monsters, period. They cannot use monster effects. Like, if you normal summon this and they have a board of 5 monster negates, they cannot activate any of those monster negates, because this card basically says your opponent can't activate monsters. This card can out almost anything. It is an absolutely disgusting card. It was really good in True Dracos, because you could just normal summon this and your opponent can't respond. No Ash, no Veiler, no Ghost Ogre on the field spell, nothing. And then you could just basically go through your regular stuff. This card is actually by far the best spirit monster. It's also good, obviously, in a pure spirit deck, because you could just normal summon this. Your opponent's locked out of their monster effects, but this excludes spirit monsters, so you're still good. You're still completely fine. Yeah, by far and away the best spirit monster. Next is Tsukiyomi, continuing the Sasuke Uchiha cards. This card is... It's between C and B tier. Obviously, this card was very good for a very long time. It's why there's an ultimate rare of this card. It used to be a very good card. So I put it somewhere here. But again, this card... Okay, so basically, let me just go over what this does. On normal summon, this is a mandatory effect. It has to book a monster. That's the only effect it really has, and then it returns to the end phase. This card was extremely good in the game when flip monsters or flip effect monsters were very much prevalent. This card is very good in the metagame, because you can have like Magician of Faith set. You flip Magician of Faith, return a spell card to your hand, summon this, flip the Magician of Faith back face down, and then the following turn you can use that Magician of Faith again, or your opponent will attack it. You can use it with cards like Morphing Jar, stuff like that. So this card was very good for a very long time, but flip monsters are essentially unused in the metagame today. The only flip deck that is marginally relevant is Shadolls, and the issue with Shadolls is, although they are somewhat relevant, no one actually uses their flip effects. Like, it's very rare. You have to brick with Shadolls to go into their flip effects. So, for the most part, this card, although it had a lot of meta impact, and if I was doing this tier list in 2005 or 2004 or even 2006, this card would probably be up here. But unfortunately, as time has passed, as a metagame, we don't use as many flip effects as we once did, and for that reason, this card has actually moved down on the list. Alright, next we've got Fushi Notori. This card's definitely a D tier card. Basically what this does is, if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you gain life points equal to the damage. It's like, this thing is 1200 attack. What damage are you inflicting? Why is that relevant? It's not good enough. Like, spirit monsters have so many restrictions on them that their effects have to be absolutely broken to be good. Like, I almost want to put this in F tier, but believe it or not, there are actually worse cards than this card. Yeah, this card is just not good. I don't even know why. That is in every way not a great card. Gaining life points, the most you can gain is like 1200, unless you boost this card, in which case you gain more, but I don't know why you would want to do it. Really not a good card. Alright, next is Gundari. This card is, I'd say D tier. There was a point where this card was alright, but I don't think this card is good at all today. Basically what he does is, he's like Neospatian Grand Mole, but for synchro monsters. So when he battles a synchro monster, they both return. This returns to the hand, and that thing and the synchro monster returns to the extra deck. There was a point in time in Yu-Gi-Oh where this card was a decent card, but again, this does what Neospatian Grand Mold does, but Neospatian Grand Mold does it to anything, and this thing does it to just spirit monsters. So I on top of that, this only does it to synchro monsters. There was a point in time when synchro monsters were very prevalent in the metagame, and that's when this card came out. So it was a pretty cool effect to be able to return a copy of like Stardust to the extra deck and then return this thing to the hand. Like, that effect is actually fairly decent when it came out. But again, synchro monsters are not the main summoning mechanic in Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, so this card has definitely faded in use. Alright, next is Otohime. This card is like F tier, definitely. It is not a good card at all. It's actually one of the cards Noah uses, and there's actually, believe it or not, of all of the spirit monsters, this one actually has an alternate art. It's not I think it's an OCG exclusive alternate art. I don't know why this card has an alternate art. It's not a good card at all. Has 0 attack, 100 defense, terrible stats. Basically, when this card is normal summon, you can target a monster your opponent controls and then change his battle position. Not a great effect at all. This is actually a worse Tsukiyomi, and Tsukiyomi is on the verge of being C tier because it's just been so power crept. And this is like, this got power crept in essentially a similar set where this came out. This came out in Dark Crisis, and this probably came out in LOD, which was Legacy of Darkness. This came out like a set or two after this card. Like, it almost immediately got power crept. Otohime is not a great card. Alright, next is Shinobird Crow. This card is not all that great either. So basically what this card does is, it's like in a sense, it's like a reverse Honest. Basically what this card does is, when you attack an opponent, or when this card battles, you can discard a spirit monster, and then this card gains attack equal to that spirit monster. The only issue is this card has 0 attack. So you just, instead of summoning this thing, you just summon that monster, and then you probably get an additional effect, as all spirit monsters have effects. So I don't know why you would want to play this. It's just not good. And the sad thing about this one is, this is one of the more modern ones, so I have no clue why this effect is so bad. You could theoretically use something like a Shinobird card, because the Shinobird cards are like 3,000 attack and stuff like that. But again, like, wouldn't you just want to summon the Shinobird card instead of using this card? I don't know. I don't like Shinobird Crow at all. When it came out, I just thought it was weird. Susa Warrior, this is another F tier. Basically, this is a level 4 monster that is 2,000 attack. That was like the big selling point when this came out. This probably came out in Legacy of Darkness too. Basically, the stats were very good when it came out. Today, we have normal monsters that are 2,000 attack, so it's kind of irrelevant. We have a ton of Omega Smasher X. We have Gene Rep, Warwolf, Alexandrite Dragon. We have a ton of normal monsters with absolutely no restrictions that are 2,000 attack. But the major restriction of this card is that it was a spirit monster, so it bounces back during the end phase. And in addition to that, any battle damage that this card does is halved. So if you attack directly, you only inflict 1,000 anyway. If you battle a monster and it's 1,600 and this gets over it, you only inflict 200. So it's sort of pointless, especially when you have, even at the time that this came out, or you had monsters that were 1,900 attack with no restrictions. So it's kind of pointless to have this thing. Alright, next is Maharagi. I'd say this is probably bottom of D tier, could be F. Basically what this card does is, outside of the artwork's actually pretty cool. It's like spooky, very scary. It's a decent artwork. Basically what this card does is, when it's normal summon or flip face up, during the next time that you draw, you look at the card that you're about to draw, and you decide whether to put it on the bottom of your deck or put it back on the top of your deck. It's really slow, like really, really slow, because it's just I don't know why you would want to. There's better stuff to do. There are cards that will let you draw that card. There are cards that will let you like book an opponent's monster, give you an extra normal summon of spirit monster. Like, this card is just like what, like that is, it's just not it's not relevant. It's not good at all in modern Yu-Gi-Oh. All right, next is Resetsu. This card is about, I'd say D tier, right around here. Basically what this does is when it's normal summoned, you can target a monster your opponent controls and then reveal a spirit monster and then return that monster to your opponent's hand. This card would be better if it didn't absolutely get power crept later on. So because it got power crept, this card's actually not that great. But yeah, it's I guess decent removal. All right, next is Izanami. This card's actually fairly decent. I'd say this card is actually somewhere in B tier. Basically, when this card is normal summoned, you can discard a card and then add a spirit monster from your graveyard back to your hand. There actually isn't a lot of ways to get spirit monsters from your graveyard back to your hand, because most spirit monsters can't be special summoned from the graveyard, so you can't like monster reborn them, you can't bring them back in most reasonable ways. So it's actually a fairly decent way to sort of recycle or recover spirit monsters, and it only has one discard cost, so it's not like a huge deal. It's a half decent card. Next is Sacred Spirit of the Ice Barrier. I'd say probably around D tier. Basically what this card does is, it's actually a worse version of this Resetsu. Basically what this card does is, if you have this card is basically a regular spirit monster if you don't control another ice barrier. But if you control another ice barrier, instead of this card returning to your hand, your opponent you have to pick a card your opponent controls and return that card to the hand. So basically it does essentially what Resetsu does, but you need to control an ice barrier, which, to be honest with you, like ice barriers, most of the time they want to go into their synchro monsters. They don't want to end their board on a sacred ice barrier card. Like there's no point. Like you want to go into Trishula, you want to go into Brionac, you want to go into all that cool stuff. You don't want to end your board on this thing. This thing is just dumb. So most of the time you're going to want to go into better stuff. Next is King Kabuyo. This card has a ton of meta impact. It's probably, I'd say fairly easily, an A tier card. Basically what this card does, it's a level 1 beast, which is already pretty good. It's got like good typing, all that stuff. Or is it level 1 or level 2? Yeah, it's a level 1. But it's very important that it's a level 1, because there are a ton of ways that you can search it with Where Art Thou. You can, you can summon, you can't summon it off of 1-for-1, but you can search it with Where Art Thou, stuff like that. But this card's effect is actually fairly good, which is when it's normal summoned, you can special summon a level 1 monster from your graveyard, which is pretty good for level 1 decks. It's really good in like Lyrilusk and various beast decks, stuff like that. Yeah, it's actually a fairly decent card, I'd have to say. Its stats, like I said, are just okay, but it basically allows you to go into XYZ plays. And then when you bring that level 1 monster back from your graveyard, you banish it when it leaves the field. But most people go into XYZ monsters with this little combo. So in the end, you actually, because you go into an XYZ monster anyway, you'll detach the material and it'll go to graveyard anyway. So it's actually, this card is actually a fairly decent card. It's been meta impactful quite a few times, and it's actually played in a few different decks right now, so it's actually a fairly good card. Next is, I think, is Fung Hong. This card, I'd say, is probably top of C tier. Basically what this card does is, when it's normal summoned, and it is a level 6 monster, right? Yep, it's a level 6 monster. Basically what this card does, when it's normal summoned, you can destroy all Spell and Trap cards on the field. It's not a bad effect. I think it came out a little bit too late. I think if it came out sooner, it would be used significantly more. Like if it came out in like 2004, 2005, it would be used more often to clear back row. And it would actually give more back row removal options for that time period. I'd say it's a fairly decent card. There's definitely worse cards. Again, the only thing really counting against it is the fact that it's a 1-tripping monster. Shinobird Crow is, I'd say, it's somewhere around here, like A, B, somewhere in this area. It's actually a decent card. I'd say it's right next to Aritama. Basically what this card does is, if this card's on the field and you normal or special summon a spirit monster while this card is face up on the field, you get to draw a card. That effect is once per turn, but it is a soft once per turn. So if you have 2 Shinobird Cranes on the field, you get to draw 2 cards, because they are soft once per turn. So it's once per turn per card. Basically, you could draw multiple cards, but it's a half decent effect. Again, this deck has trouble accumulating advantage because you basically spit your whole hand onto the board as much as you can. So draw power is not like a huge aspect of this deck, but I'd say this is a decent card, lets you draw. Definitely a half decent card. All right, next is Gishki Amelia. She's better than Gishki Natalia, but not by a whole lot. Basically, when she's normal summoned, you can negate the effects of all trap cards on the field until the end phase. Not a bad effect. It's kind of in a certain way like Emadoewado. It doesn't prevent your opponent from like activating, chaining, stuff like that, but it does negate their effects. So I guess that's half decent, but you have to control another Gishki monster to do this effect. And to be honest with you, even in a Gishki deck, there are just better things to play than this card, by far. Next is Hinokaga Suchi. Unfortunately, and I really say this unfortunately, this card is C tier. I really like this card. Like, I like the design of it. I like the artwork. I think this is a great card. The only problem is it's a 2 tribute monster, and that is really rough in a spirit deck because your monsters are all bouncing back to your hand anyway the entire time. And let's say you wanted to splash this card into another deck, there aren't a lot of cards that would be able to utilize this card, because this card's effect is basically when it inflicts battle damage during your opponent's next draw phase, they discard essentially they discard their entire hand right before their draw phase, which that effect is pretty good. Like, it's a good effect, but the problem is it like almost will never go off because, again, you have to play a deck that can special summon 2 monsters without committing a normal summon. And there are very few decks that can do that. And again, you have to do this while going second, because this card is only useful going second. Because going first, it does absolutely nothing. You can't inflict battle damage going first. So you have to go second. You have to special summon 2 monsters. You have to be able to tribute those 2 monsters for this thing. And then after you do that, this thing goes back to your hand anyway. So unfortunately, as much as I like this card, the 2 tribute cost is just far too great. Yeah, there's just no way you're getting this off unless you're like on turn like 3-4 of the duel, in which case you should have already won with better strategies. Next is Yamada Dragon. This card is actually better than Amaterasu and Hinokaga Suchi. Basically, what this card does is it's similar to Hinokaga Suchi, where it's 2 tributes, but basically what it does is if you inflict battle damage, you get to draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand. That is an amazing effect. But again, it's a true tribute monster. You have to be playing a deck that can special summon monsters and not commit a normal summon, which is, again, it's asking for a lot. A lot of Yu-Gi-Oh decks in the modern day, they start with a normal summon. Like, their combo starts with a normal summon. They don't get another normal summon. And this card can't be special summoned, just like Hinokaga Suchi. So unfortunately, as good as that effect is, and that effect is very good, drawing until you have 6 cards, or it might be 5 cards, but drawing that many cards is a crazy effect. The only issue is it very rarely goes off. And again, you have to be going second, which is pretty good because you can like set all of your spawn trap cards, activate your field spell, summon this, make sure that you have 0 cards in your hand, and then attack and draw a ton of cards. In theory, that's a great effect, but there are just not a lot of decks that can do it. Like, off the top of my head, the only decks I can think of that can special summon a bunch without committing a normal summon are like ritual decks such as Drytron, Nekroz, and then there's stuff like Tenyi, for example. But there aren't a lot of decks that are going to be able to summon this monster, and the ones that can have better options, like Vanity's Ruler, for example, just general stuff like that. So as good as this card's last effect is, the stats on this card, unfortunately, make it, in combination with the fact that it's a spirit, make it very not that playable. Next is Inaba White Rabbit. This card's actually not that bad. I'll explain it as it kind of goes on. I'd say it's somewhere here. Inaba White Rabbit basically is a pretty simple card. When it it can attack directly, but it's 700 attack. It can attack directly. It doesn't sound that great, but it's a spirit monster, so it can return back to your hand during the end phase. This card's fairly good in a Mystic Mind deck, because during the end phase, you This card bounces back to your hand. So if your opponent has a full board, you activate Mystic Mine and you attack directly. It inflicts 700. During the end phase, it bounces itself back, and now your board is cleared again. So you could just put your opponent in this constant loop where they're getting attacked, and this card will always bounce itself back during the end phase anyway. So they will always have a monster, and you always won't have a monster. It actually is a pretty frustrating situation for an opponent. But for that reason, this card's okay overall. Next is Yaksha. This card's effect is, I'd say, decent. Basically, when this card is normal summoned, you can target a spawn trap card they control, return it to the hand. I'd say it's a half decent effect. It's definitely not like the worst, but there are literally better ways to do it in this deck. Next is Dusk Spirit. This card, I'd say, is next to Feng Hang. Basically what this card does is, and this had more meta impact than Feng Hang. Basically what this card does is when it's normal summoned and it's a 1 tribute monster, you can destroy all other monsters on the field. It's like Dark Hole, decent effect, like a fairly good effect. It was a decent card in 05. Again, it can't be special summoned, has to be tribute summoned. Requires, and it does destroy things, and at least it's not, like level 8, like these guys, level 7, level 8. So at least it takes 1 tribute, which is very possible. It did have some meta impact in like 2005, 2006. It was actually a fairly good combo with Cyber Dragon, because you could special summon Cyber Dragon, tribute the Cyber Dragon immediately, and then destroy all monsters on the field. It's pretty cool effect. But again, it's just the combination of the stats and everything make it an issue. All right, next is Hebo, Lord of the River. I'd say this is top of C tier. Basically what this card does is, like Yaksha, it bounces a card. It has a pretty cool effect where when it's normal summon, you could target any monster on the field. That monster becomes a spirit monster, and then it gets bounced during the end phase because it's now a spirit monster, so you can bounce your opponent's monsters. I'd say it's a fairly cool effect. It's definitely got, it bounces 1 card. It's not like super broken, but it's definitely a half decent effect. Next is Shinobird Pigeon. This card is like a mess. I don't even understand why this card exists. I put it right here. Basically what this card does is once per turn, you can target 1 other monster you control and return it to the hand. I have no clue why you would want to do this. Your spirit deck, like the entire point of a spirit deck is they all bounce during the end phase. So all you're doing is just bouncing early. Like, I don't understand why you would want to do this. It is completely confusing to me. I don't think the card is good at all. I don't get it. Next is Sheeno Baroness Peacock. I'd say this is probably A tier. Where it goes, I don't know. I'd say right there. She's a really good card. So all of the we are now in the special summon area. So let me move this back down. The remaining monsters right here all can be special summoned. So while all of these can only be normal summoned or flipped face up or set face down, these can all be special summoned. So they differ from the old spirit monsters. It's actually fairly interesting that they made, they made that difference. They still return during the end phase, which is, kind of like the binding mechanic of all spirit monsters. But these are fairly good. So I guess I'll review this Sheeno Baron first. Basically, he's a ritual monster, but he's also a spirit. What he basically does is, when he is ritual summoned to the field, you can you can return 3 monsters your opponent controls back to their hand, and then you can summon a spirit monster from your hand, level 4 or lower, ignoring summoning conditions. And that's extremely good, because all of the previous spirit monsters that I've shown you all have the restriction that they cannot be special summoned. So it can actually special summon monsters that typically cannot be special summoned. So it can summon Emadoewado, which is a huge deal. It can summon that from the hand. It can special summon any of these other ones, like Nikki Tama, Ari Tama, stuff like that. A lot of them unfortunately have effects on normal summon, so you'll miss those effects. But stuff like Emadoewado is a continuous effect. Once it hits the field, your opponent can't activate anything else. So that effect is very good. And like I said, it bounces 3 monsters to your opponent's hand. non-targeting, which is an absolutely just insane effect. Non-targeting, and it bounces. It can get rid of Dragoon. It can get rid of huge monsters that can't be targeted. It doesn't destroy. It doesn't banish. Like, it just returns. That really, really, really good effect. Next is Shino Baroness. I'd say she is... You can make the argument that she's better, but you can also... Like, it's tough. More decks play monsters than spawn trap cards, so in a certain sense, Baron will always be better than Baroness. Basically, her effect is when she's summoned, you can return up to 3 spawn trap cards your opponent controls, but instead of returning them to the hand like Shino Baron, you actually shuffle them back into the deck, which that effect is insane. And on top of that, you can special summon a spirit monster from your deck, ignoring summoning conditions that are level 4 or lower. So the effect of this one, of Shino Baroness, is objectively better. The only issue is more decks play monsters that are a threat than spawn trap cards that are a threat. So generally speaking, Shino Baron will be more useful in more situations than Shino Baroness. But when Shino Baroness goes off, she's absolutely amazing. Both of them have an effect during the end phase. If they are summoned that turn, well, basically during the end phase, they return back to your hand and they special summon 2 tokens onto the field that are level 4, basically level 4 tokens. So basically all of the levels that they had on, all of the field presence that they had is basically restored because it summons 2 tokens onto the field that are 1500 attack, 1500 defense, and both level 4. So it's pretty cool. It's like free tokens, and then next turn you could just use those tokens as whatever you want. Link material, ritual material, whatever you need. Next is Konohana Sakuya. This is actually a new card. I actually don't really like it all that much. Basically what it does is, if you control a spirit monster, you can special summon this card, and then it has the typical spirit effect, which it bounces back to the end phase during the end phase, and then it has a secondary effect, which is if this card's in the graveyard, you can banish it, and then if a spirit, basically, you can negate a spirit, you can stop your spirit monster during the end phase from activating its effect, which basically means it can prevent a spirit monster from bouncing itself, because it negates it stops its effects from activating during the end phase. So if you have, for example, Emadoewado on the field, you have this in graveyard, end phase, activate this, it stops one spirit monster from returning itself to the hand or activating its effects. So during the end phase, this wouldn't activate its effect to bounce itself. So for that reason, it's like fairly decent. I forgot to mention, if you summon the Emadoewado off of, or any spirit monster off of Shino Baroness or Shino Baron, they actually don't get bounced back. Every spirit monster basically says if it's normal summon that turn, it returns to the end phase, but if you special summon a spirit monster, which is typically not possible, it basically allows you to get around that whole bouncing back during the end phase, so it's actually pretty cool. Alright, next we've got Yamato Nokami. This card is actually fairly interesting. I'd say this is somewhere in B tier, somewhere around here. Basically, what this card does is if you have a spirit monster in the graveyard, you can banish that spirit monster, special summon this card. During the end phase, it still returns to your hand, but the summon is actually fairly easy, so that makes the card significantly better. The only drawback, and then it has an additional effect, which is when it attacks, when it destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can destroy a spawn trap card your opponent controls, which that effect, I never like those effects, the ones where like after you attack you destroy a spawn trap card, because it's like if they had an interruption they would have already activated it, so it kind of makes it doesn't make sense to destroy afterwards. Like they're going to use every single interruption anyways, but it's actually a fairly decent card. It's one of the very few special summons that spirits have available, so for that reason it's actually kind of good. Because you can like do small combos, like you can do like a Nikki Tama, and then you can special summon this card, and then you have 2 monsters to summon, like a Yamada Dragon or something like that. So it's got some like it's a special summon in a deck full of very few special summons, basically. All right, the next 3 are 3 Pendulum Monsters. They all do different things. They're all fairly decent. They actually are not good in spirit decks, because spirit decks can't special summon the monsters. So there's absolutely no point to have a pendulum summon in a spirit deck. But these cards are actually somewhat decent. They're different martial arts. We have, this is sumo, karate, and kembo. So it's kind of like, it's cool representation, I suppose, of martial arts. And it's all spirit. They're all spirit pendulum monsters. Like I said, you can't really use them in a spirit deck, but certain ones are good in pendulum decks. This one is actually, I think Sumo's actually the best. I put him somewhere here. He's good in a pendulum deck. Basically what he does is when he's normal summoned, you can send every single card every monster your opponent controls in the pendulum zones to the graveyard. And it's non-targeting removal. It's just sending to the graveyard. So if you have two pendulum scales activated, and you can send every single monster in there to the graveyard. Then we've got karate. He's less good. He's probably around like C tier. Basically what he does is you can send all spell and trap cards in the pendulum zones to the graveyard, but again, it's like, your opponent will just respond with the spell and trap cards. They'll chain to this effect, so it's not quite as good. And then the last one is Kembo, and this one basically is, I guess it's somewhere around here. It's similar to karate, where you pick one pendulum zone and then send all cards. So instead of monsters or spawn trap cards, you just pick one pendulum zone instead of both, and you just send cards to the graveyard. So again, it's kind of like a cool option for pendulum decks to help out their board, to help out your opponent's board. It's not a terrible like pendulum option, I suppose, but you're definitely not using it in a spirit deck, that's for sure. All right, next is Mirror of Yada. I'd say this is somewhere in D tier. This card's kind of like, it's dumb. Basically all it does is it's an equip spell that if a spirit monster would be returned to your hand during the end phase, it doesn't get returned because it's equipped to this card. It's dumb. It's like dealing with a restriction on an art. It's like dealing with the whole point of the deck. Like the whole point of the deck is that the cards return to the end phase, and now you have to play a whole second card just to deal with the fact that your monsters, just based on their own effects, will return. It's dumb. It doesn't make sense. The Shinobird spell cards are a lot better than this because they actually give you advantage when your cards return, which is a lot better than just your cards not returning. And to a certain degree, with how spirit monsters have sort of developed over time, it's actually better if the cards return to your hand anyway. Next is Shinobird Power Spot. This card's really good. I'd say somewhere in the second half of B tier. I think if you're playing a pure spirit deck, this should always be in there. Shinobirds, though, sometimes I actually don't play this card. I actually opt to play more of a Winwitch engine with the Shinobirds, but I mean, that's my personal preference. But this card's definitely very good. But basically what it does is all spirit monsters gain 500 attack. Already pretty good. It makes Emadoewado a 2400 attack monster, and with the Shinobirds, it doesn't have to be returned to the hand or the deck, so that's a very good effect. Very, very good effect. 2400 monster, and your opponent can't activate monster effects. It's actually kind of hard to get rid of. Secondly, this card has an effect where if one of your spirit monsters is returned to the hand, you can search for either any spirit monster in the game or any ritual spell in the game. Like either way, it's really, really good for searching. The only thing is, like I said, I'd prefer to play Sheeno. Shinobirds is more of an OTK sort of instant kind of win deck. I don't really want to go into a grind game with this deck. But if you were going to go into a grind game, this is definitely the kind of card you want to run. And if you're playing pure spirits, you definitely are running this card. It's a very good card. Next is Sword of Kusanagi. This is better than like a lot of these other cards, but it's not like that great. Basically what it does is it's an equip spell that gives piercing to a spirit monster. It's an okay effect. The benefit, I suppose, is that a lot of spirit monsters have effects where things happen if they inflict battle damage. So like Yamada Dragon, Hino Kagasuchi, if it was unbanned, Yatagaratsu, stuff like that. They have effects when battle damage is inflicted. So in certain ways, it's actually good to give it piercing. Also, it has a pretty cool effect where if the monster is returned to the hand and this card is sent to the graveyard, you can return this card to the hand in addition to that. So it kind of works around the the issues of spirit monsters themselves. But overall, I'd say it's just kind of like a decent card. You definitely wouldn't want to play it. They're just better ways to increase your attack. They're better, piercing you don't really need. Like I said, they're just better cards to play. This is the Shinobird ritual spell. I'll just put it next to the Shinobirds. This is actually a fairly good ritual spell. Basically, it does what normal ritual spells do, which is, you contribute monsters in your hand or field. It has to be spirit monsters. No, it can be any monsters in your hand or field, up to the levels of the Shinobirds, which is the usual effect. But then you can also banish spirit monsters out of your graveyard and special summon instead of having to use the cost on field. So in a way, it kind of works around the cost, which is pretty cool. Because if you have, like, for example, Sheeno Baroness in graveyard, you can summon Sheeno Baron by banishing from the graveyard instead of having to have ritual cost on field. So that's kind of like, it's certainly a cool workaround. Also, this ritual spell is good with Nikki Tama because Nikki Tama goes to the graveyard and then you get to draw a card. You replenish some of your losses in that way. Alright, next is Spiritual Energy Settle Machine. This card is, again, I'm going to put it next to this mirror. It is a card built to deal with the restrictions of the summoning mechanic of spirits. Like, their whole point is they return to the hand, and there are benefits and there are drawbacks to them returning to the hand. This card is a continuous spell that basically makes it so your spirit monsters don't have to return back to the hand. The issue with this is there's a terrible cost with this, which is for every single turn you have to discard a card from your hand in order to keep this card on the field, so it will destroy any advantage that you would gain from having them on the field. On top of that, if this card is removed from the field, instantly all of your spirit monsters go right back to the hand. So literally one single MST causes all of your monsters to go back. It's just horrific it's a card meant to deal with a restriction that has a terrible restriction. So it's a mess in a lot of different ways. Alright, next is Feng Sheng Mirror. This card is great against spirit decks, not good against regular decks. So basically what this card does is it lets you look at your opponent's hand, and if they have a spirit monster, you discard that spirit monster. That effect is good. Like, if spirit monsters ever become, like, really, really meta relevant, like every single deck is playing spirits, this card is very good. The only issue, like, if they come out, for example, with, like, a really broken, like, if Nibiru, for example, was a spirit, this card would be in the meta. The issue is virtually no one plays spirits. The only spirit that is roughly played, I'd say, is probably the Emadoewado. Other than that, for the most part, most spirit monsters are not played. If they come out with, like, 3 or 4 broken spirit hand traps, I can imagine this card becoming maybe an A or B tier. But as of right now, all of this basically does is let you look at your opponent's hand. They won't have any spirit monsters, and it'll just be you looking at your opponent's hand. You're better off playing something like Drag Down to get rid of your opponent's hand traps, if that's what you're concerned with, if you're worried about your opponent's hand. But definitely not this card. All right, next is Orb of Yasaka. This is another equipped spell. It's actually worse than the sword. Basically what it does is when your opponent's monster destroys a monster by battle, you get to gain life points equal to that monster, which is, I don't know why, it doesn't advance you in any way. It'll gain you a few thousand life points, 100 life points, I don't know. Not a lot of life points, but during the end phase, when your spirit monsters return, this card's sent to the graveyard, this card's returned back to your hand. You really don't gain any ground because you're just returning what you lost, so it's not really that big of a deal. Really not a great card. Alright, next is Shinobird Salvation. I'd say this is somewhere in, like, B tier. This card is actually not that great in a Shinobird deck. This card is actually better in a pure spirit deck, if you were playing pure spirit deck. Basically what it does is, because spirit decks are a little more control based, basically what this card does is if a spirit monster is returned to your hand, you can destroy a card on the field. That effect is actually fairly decent because you're going to be returning a ton of monsters all throughout to your hand anyway. And then it has a second effect where you can banish a spirit monster out of the graveyard when your opponent declares an attack, negate that attack, and then end the battle phase. That effect, again, is very, very good too. Most of the time, your spirit monsters are pretty much dead in the graveyard, like you'll never use them. The only cards that use them are the monster that's right here that summons itself by banishing a spirit, or their ritual spell. Those are really the only ways. And then Izanagi returns stuff to your hand. Other than that, you really don't use a great deal. You don't really get a great deal of spirit monsters back from the graveyard anyway, so they're kind of like a dead resource. Like I said, this card is definitely, like, if you were playing like a spirit control deck based around like Emadoewado, I would say this card is actually fairly good because it protects Emadoewado. On top of that, it when a spirit monster returns, you get the pop cards, which is a pretty decent effect. But again, in the Shinobird deck, I look at this more as like an OTK going second deck, breaking boards. It's a trap card is just not relevant in that scenario, but it is a fairly good card all around. Legacy of Yatagaratsu. This card is just Jar of Greed, but better, honestly. I'd say this is, again, it's here about. Basically what this does is you flip it, you get to draw a card. If your opponent controls a spirit monster, you get to draw 2 cards. The likelihood of your opponent controlling a spirit monster is extraordinarily slim. They probably won't be controlling a spirit monster, so I think C tier is more than fair for that card. Yeah, definitely somewhere in that department. Like I said, it depends. Like I said, it's just another Jar of Greed, to be honest with you. All right, next is Spirit Invitation. This is another card. I'd say this card is built to deal with the limits of spirits. Basically, every single time a card is returned, spirit monster is returned to your hand, you can return a monster your opponent controls back to their hand. It is a trap card meant to deal with a board. So you have to realize when this card is actually going to be useful. You're going to set it. You're going to have spirit monster. Your spirit monster is going to return back to your hand. Then your opponent's turn will start. They'll have a full turn, and then it goes back to your turn. Now you summon a spirit monster. It returns to your hand, and you finally, on turn 3, are able to return a monster to their side of the field. So it's not useful until like 3 turns in, because obviously turn 1 you're not going to have anything to bounce. Turn 2 it's a trap card, so you can't use it, and then turn 3 it's finally actually usable. So it's extra. Actually, all my convincing has actually made me go to F tier. On top of that, you have to pay life points every single end phase to keep this on field, which is 500 life points. It's a card built to deal with the problems of spirits. It's like they created an archetype with a major restriction, and then they came out with a bunch of cards to get around that restriction that have major restrictions. It doesn't make sense. That's why a lot of the older spirits are actually trash, and a lot of the newer ones are just objectively better. Like overall, there's only one banned spirit card that, in all honesty, probably shouldn't even be banned. It's only banned because it's banned for more of like structural reasons. Konami doesn't like cards that skip your opponent's draw phase, so that's why Yatagaratsu is banned. Other than that, like for the most part, it shouldn't even be banned. But that was the spirit list. If you have any other ideas for any other list, just let me know. I'm going to be trying to pump out a lot more of these over the next few days. I've been playing a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm excited to get started on the rest of these videos. But thank you for watching. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, check out the other videos on the channel. And please subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. Again, thank you so much. Have a terrific day.